like elephants, antelope, lions, cats, zebra, birds, insects, and plants have their own purpose and power. All indigenous people in the world use totems as symbols of kinship. It is one of the oldest, most sustainable environmental conservation tools. They reflect relationships of trust, wisdom, respect, and understanding. In Africa, these totems gave rise to stigmatization, name-calling, abuse, and comparisons to animals. Capitalist ventures such as mining are therefore sacrilege and the destruction of us all. The arrival of European women was the destruction of families and households. Indigenous women were forced into domestic servitude roles as wet nurses, nannies, and taught to cook European cuisine. European women were to set the example of how civilized women behave, and much of what was defined as civilized was what happened in the kitchen. When patriarchy arrived in the Cape, it imposed on matriarchs private marriages, forcing them into contractual reproductive servitude, tending to their husband's every need. It was custom for thousands of years to pray daily, outdoors, at sunrise, facing east. Sacred song and chanting was a way to feel closer to the Creator. Group prayers were for all-night rituals and ceremony. These all-night sacred song and chanting worship was soon replaced by night sermons and Christian hymns. The colonizers saw themselves as the educator and civilizer, and in order to do both, the colonizer needed missionaries. Missionaries arrived in the colonies with a cultural bias, religious snobbery, and beliefs that the inferiority of Africans was the result of a lack of Christianity. We needed saving from our lives devoid of meaning, religion, and culture. Missionaries were imperialist informants sent to the colonies on condition of loyalty and were ruled by the intentions of their governments. In portraying themselves as independent, selfless individuals, risking life and limb to travel to foreign savage lands to save uncivilized beasts. Their condemnation and demonization of African customs and systems greatly benefited colonization. Missionary stations styled themselves as places of refuge where those driven off their land and strangled by a multitude of restrictions would have a fixed place of abode. Natives had no choice but to depend on the missionaries to handle their grievances, a double-edged sword. In the Cape Colony, the Dutch Reformed Church became the moral guardian. This resulted in colonial churches, including churches like the Moravian Church, now owning large tracts of ill-gained land. The guiding principles were laid out in the Charter of the year in 70. Their religious foundations were called the Synod of Dort, and it points out 5 points of Calvinism, and this originated in 1618. Missionaries were divisive in traditional society. They discouraged converts from participating in sinful, demonic customs and rituals, and to stay neutral in resistance wars. They pitted the converted against the heathen and played a huge role in the assault on societies. Missionaries focused on the eradication of cultural dress. This undermined the emotional and physical bonds sustained through these garments and caused deep-seated loss of spirituality, personal and communal dignity. For the colonizer, the imposition of European clothing was an assertion of superiority of all things European and the presumption of an eager acceptance of foreign culture. Cattle raiding is iconic in colonial history. Not so iconic is the massacre and abduction of women and children associated with it. In 1674, the Groot Commander, the Great Commander, having received official sanction from the Heeren 70, split into 3 groups for their murderous ventures. From the early 1700s, militia and vigilantes were ordered to mercilessly hunt Khoi San groups. By 1873, the San was hunted to near extinction. Between 1835 and 1843, approximately 12,000 colonists sought freedom from British rule and left the Cape. They became known as the Trekboere. After losing their free labor during the emancipation of foreign slaves, the Trekboere and their commandos moved into the hinterland and intensified the burning of homes and crops, raids for land, indigenous women, children, and cattle. The Groot Trek was simply a ravenous, bloodthirsty orgy of wild, wild West-style mass murder and land grabs. Trekboere were traditionally illiterate religious peasants who refused British education. They would identify the land they want, mobilize their commandos, raid the homestead, and take it all. Indigenous people are not surprised by the massacres ordered by European settler and founder of the California's Hastings College of Law between the 1840s and the 1870s, killing thousands of men, women, and children. That became public this week. British settler Richard Collins, who toured the Cape between 1808 and 1809, boasted that in his youth, he and his commandos killed 3,200 natives. It was not unusual for settlers to be rewarded for their savagery. Paul Kruger, President of South Africa from 1883 to 1900, was a celebrated commando leader, slave capturer and trader, and a land grabber for many, many decades. Storytelling became the only revolution of indigenous people when land, life, and liberties were destroyed. We know what happened to us because it happened to us. Chattel, vagabond, Hottentot laborer, Khoisan laborer, apprentices were terms used to describe indigenous slaves. For over 350 years, the Khoi and the San were labeled all of the above, all at the same time, but we were never called slaves and serfs, which is what we were. The history of slavery of indigenous people has been completely erased and replaced by that of foreign enslaved people. Both Khoi and San buried our umbilical cords of our newborns and remains of ancestors close by our homes and were traumatized by being forced to abandon them. The psychological conditions of captured people were dire, having witnessed brutal murder, decapitation, gang rapes of children, mothers and themselves and their families and communities, and the loss of their homes. The common method of payment for captured people was food and alcohol, and the supply of alcohol was also used to subdue traumatized people. This caused generations of birth defects and the condition known as fetal alcohol syndrome, and the continued labeling of indigenous people as drunkards and belligerents. Indigenous women and children were viewed as the property of those who captured or bought them. Children belonged to whoever owned the mother. They could be sold, hired out, gifted, and inherited. Women had their reproductive systems exploited. The children born out of the exploitations were enslaved, increasing the wealth of the colonizer. Sexual exploitation in the Cape included property being forced to have sex with their master's guests and rented out to passing ships. The Dutch and the British colonizer refused to provide their offspring with citizenship or their father's legal and social status. They became known as the busters or the bastards. In the 1800s, there were approximately 35,000 African women and children and men in European zoos performing in exotic spectacles 6 days a week. These exhibitions gave rise to racist politics and cultural beliefs about wild savages and assisted in the interrogation of the link between animals and humans, promoting fear of miscegenation and the assertion of moral and intellectual superiority. This dehumanizing practice reached its peak between 1847 and 1940. African names have great meaning to us and those who bestow it on us. Naming a child some time after birth helps shape a child's identity. This is the name that the child will be known as by the family, community, and ancestors. She last heard her name when she was in her teens, before she was captured by colored brothers Hendrik and Pieter Caesar and their commando. The most important human specimen was studied and dissected by naturalists, zoologists, and anatomists. She was exhibited and displayed as a spectacle in public in cages, on leashes, with baby wild animals. With Nelson Mandela's intervention, her remains were finally returned. Feminists, anthropologists, historians, academics, and sensationalists celebrated her return while ignoring that she was buried in an inaccessible location and that she didn't know that the place where her gravestone, carrying the name Sarah Bartman, a name she received in Manchester at the age of 21. That name humiliated her throughout her life. Yet, it was celebrated that her gravestone carried that name. No 19th century natural history museum could be complete without a large collection of human remains. The most sought after were the remains of Khoi and Son, skulls, made it into private collections of the elite. By the 1850s, Khoi and Son skulls could be found in almost all European collections. The University of Cape Town still holds 9,000 boxes of our ancestral remains. Saying we studied your people in history is extremely dehumanizing. We keep saying we are not one people, we are many peoples. It begs the question, what part did you study? Our genitalia, our skulls, or our brains? Cultural appreciation and cultural exchange are important in human development. Fetishization is the act of one-sided cultural exchange, and when culture is reduced to a single stereotype. Settler storytellers represent our prayers as hallucinogenic secret plant healing dances, somehow connected to the moon, completely recontextualizing the meanings of ritual and ceremony, confusing sacred with secret, spiritual with traditional. Our cultures have become victims of settler obsession with magic, witches, and witchcraft. During rampant Afrikaner nationalism, the battle for indigenous stories caused dismay in both indigenous communities and Afrikaner purist circles. At that time, the African Tokkolosh penetrated Afrikaner beliefs, and thousands of stories were written about their Tokkolosh. Some of his characteristics, especially sexual interactions, were omitted to protect the moral virtues of white women. Protua of South Africa, Pocahontas of America, and Malinche of Mexico. The colonial narrative portrays the European man as God, And these oversexed, opportunistic, European status-seeking, little wild girl children born of indigenous royalty fall in love and seduces them. This kind of feel-good story soothes the settler about their history and convinces them that the genocides were harmless because even the cream of indigenous crop found the European irresistible. There's never any mention of how their powerful fathers sent tens of thousands of men to rescue them. The mixed marriage